The harsh spring wind carried echoes of whispers across Eagar, Arizona territory, in 1879. But Virginia Sanders heard them clear as day, cruel words trailing her like a shadow as she hurried down the dusty main street, clutching her shawl tightly against both the chill and her shame. Barren, they called her. Worthless. The words stung deeper than any physical wound, each syllable a reminder of her greatest failure and deepest sorrow. Virginia had been cast aside by her husband of 3 years, Jeremiah Holcomb, a wealthy cattle rancher who had decided a wife who couldn't bear children was no wife at all. The divorce papers had been signed just yesterday, and already she felt like a ghost in a town she'd once called home. As she passed Dobson's General Store, Virginia kept her gaze fixed on the wooden boardwalk beneath her boots, avoiding the pitying stares of townsfolk who had nothing better to gossip about than a woman deemed defective by her husband. At 24 years old, she was now considered damaged goods, her future prospects as barren as they claimed her womb to be. "Miss Virginia," called out Mrs. Peterson, the kindly widow who owned the dress shop where Virginia had once been a regular customer. "I heard what happened. That man is a fool, if you ask me." Virginia managed a small, grateful smile but couldn't bring herself to stop. She couldn't bear another conversation filled with awkward pauses and well-intentioned but painful platitudes. She needed to keep moving to figure out what came next. With divorce being such a scandal, her options were limited, especially in a small frontier town like Eagar. The boarding house loomed ahead, her temporary sanctuary, until she decided whether to stay and weather the storm of gossip or leave everything behind. As she climbed the steps, a commotion from down the street caught her attention. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, trail worn and dust covered. They were clearly returning from a long cattle drive, loud and boisterous as they dismounted in front of the saloon. Virginia had seen such sights before, but what caught her eye was the tall figure who hung back from the others, his face partly obscured by the brim of his hat. Even from a distance, she recognized him, Blake Sutton, foreman of the Double S Ranch, a man known for his quiet demeanor and fair treatment of his hands. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Virginia quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. She hurried inside the boarding house, her heart inexplicably beating faster. What Virginia didn't know was that Blake Sutton had heard about her situation. In a town as small as Eagar, news traveled faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm. And despite his reputation for keeping to himself, Blake had always noticed the kind-hearted woman with auburn hair who used to smile at everyone she passed. He'd noticed when those smiles had become increasingly rare over the past year, and he'd wondered why. Now he knew, and something about her situation stirred something deep within him that he couldn't quite name. Inside her sparse room at the boarding house, Virginia unpacked the few belongings Jeremiah had allowed her to take: some clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a small box of personal treasures. No furniture, no keepsakes from their marriage. He had made it clear that everything of value belonged to him. Virginia sat on the edge of the narrow bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back all day to fall. She had loved Jeremiah once, or at least she thought she had. But his love had been conditional, contingent on her ability to give him sons to inherit his ranch. When month after month, year after year passed with no sign of a child, his affection had cooled, then frosted over and finally hardened into contempt. "You're no use to me," he had said yesterday as the divorce was finalized. "Find someone else to burden with your barren arms." The memory brought fresh tears, but Virginia forced herself to stop. Crying wouldn't change anything. She needed a plan. She had a little money saved, not much, but perhaps enough to buy a train ticket to California or back east to St. Louis where her cousin lived. But the thought of starting over completely, alone in a strange place, terrified her almost as much as staying in Eagar where everyone knew of her shame. A knock at her door startled her. She quickly wiped her tears and straightened her dress before opening it to find Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, standing there with a covered tray. "I thought you might be hungry, dear," the older woman said kindly. "And I wanted to let you know that Mr. Blake Sutton stopped by and paid for your room for the next month." Virginia blinked in surprise. "Mr. Sutton? But why would he do that?" Mrs. Holloway shrugged, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. "Didn't say. Just handed over the money and said to make sure you had a place to stay while you sorted things out. He's a man of few words, that one." Long after Mrs. Holloway had left, Virginia sat by the window, watching the street below and wondering why a man she barely knew would show her such kindness. She had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with Blake Sutton over the years, mostly polite greetings when they passed on the street. He had always tipped his hat to her, his blue eyes warm but guarded beneath the brim. What could have prompted him to help her now? The next morning, Virginia woke with a sense of purpose. She couldn't accept charity, not even from someone as seemingly well-intentioned as Blake Sutton. She would find work, support herself, and pay him back every cent. Her skills were limited. She could sew reasonably well, had been educated back east before marrying Jeremiah, and knew how to keep accounts. Perhaps one of the businesses in town needed help. But as she made her way from shop to shop, the doors that had once opened wide for the wife of Jeremiah Holcomb now barely cracked for Virginia Sanders. No one would say it outright, but she understood hiring her would mean risking Jeremiah's business and influence. By midday, her hopes had dimmed considerably. She was standing outside the newspaper office, having just been gently turned away by the editor, when a voice called her name. "Miss Virginia." She turned to find Blake Sutton standing a few feet away, hat in hand. Up close, he was even taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered from years of hard ranch work, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, they were a clear, striking blue that reminded her of summer skies. "Mr. Sutton," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite her embarrassment. "I was actually hoping to speak with you. I appreciate your generosity, but I cannot accept charity. As soon as I find employment, I will repay you for the room." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No charity intended, madam. I actually came to offer you a job." Virginia's eyes widened. "A job at your ranch?" "Yes, madam. My housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, is getting on in years and could use some help. The position comes with room and board and a fair wage." He paused, then added, "It's honest work and you'd be away from town and all its talk." Virginia hesitated, torn between desperate need and propriety. "It wouldn't be appropriate for me to live at a bachelor's ranch, Mr. Sutton. Mrs. Garrett serves as chaperone, and there's a separate cabin for the housekeeper's assistant. No one would have cause to question your reputation." His expression grew more serious. "I know what it's like to be the subject of this town's whispers, Miss Virginia. Sometimes the best answer is to step away for a while." Virginia studied him, wondering what whispers he had endured. Blake Sutton was respected and Eagar, but she realized she knew very little about him beyond his reputation as a fair and hard-working rancher. "When would I start?" she asked finally. "Today, if you're willing. I've got the wagon outside town. We can collect your things and be at Double S by sundown." 3 hours later, Virginia found herself bouncing along a rutted trail in Blake Sutton's wagon, her few possessions packed in a trunk behind them. They had spoken little during the journey, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Blake occasionally pointed out landmarks or shared bits of information about the ranch, but mostly he gave her space with her thoughts. The Double S Ranch sprawled across a valley 20 miles outside Eagar, nestled against the foothills of the White Mountains. As they crested a rise, Virginia caught her first glimpse of the ranch house, a substantial two-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the spring grass. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely impressed. Blake nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Been building it up for 7 years now. Started with nothing but 50 acres and a dozen head of cattle." "You've accomplished a great deal," Virginia said, noting that the ranch was clearly prosperous. "Had help along the way," he replied modestly as he guided the wagon toward the house. "Good hands make a good ranch." As they approached, an older woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her face broke into a warm smile as she spotted them. "About time you got back, Blake Sutton," she called out. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to move to town permanently," Blake chuckled as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Mrs. Garrett, this is Miss Virginia Sanders. She'll be helping you with the house, like we discussed." Mrs. Garrett looked Virginia over with keen but kind eyes. "Well now, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? Come on in, dear. You must be tired after that dusty ride. I've got supper nearly ready and I'll show you to your cabin after." Virginia found herself welcomed into the warm kitchen, where the aroma of freshly baked bread and beef stew made her realize how little she'd eaten that day. Mrs. Garrett chattered away, filling Virginia in on the routine of the ranch house while Blake excused himself to check on some matters with the ranch hands. "He's a good man," Mrs. Garrett said, once Blake had left. "Works harder than any 3 men put together. This ranch is his whole life." "How long have you known him?" Virginia asked, curious about her new employer. "Going on 8 years now. I was his mother's friend back in Texas before she passed. When Blake decided to start fresh out here in Arizona territory, I came along to keep house for him." She paused, studying Virginia. "He told me about your situation. Not all the details, mind you, but enough." Virginia tensed, preparing herself for judgment or pity. "I see. No need to worry, child. There's no gossip here. Everyone at Double S has a past they'd rather leave behind. It's one of Blake's rules: judge by the work, not the history." Mrs. Garrett patted Virginia's hand. "Now let's get you fed and settled in. Tomorrow's soon enough to start work." That night, in the small but comfortable cabin that would be her new home, Virginia sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been contemplating leaving Arizona territory altogether, and now here she was, employed and housed on one of the most prosperous ranches in the region. As she unpacked her few belongings, Virginia found herself wondering more about Blake Sutton. What had driven him to leave Texas? What demons or disappointments had he fled? And why had he really offered her this lifeline when so many others had turned their backs? She fell asleep pondering these questions, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of horses, and the soothing chorus of crickets and night creatures. The following days settled into a routine. Virginia rose early to help Mrs. Garrett prepare breakfast for Blake and the half-dozen ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. The work was demanding but satisfying: cleaning, cooking, mending, gardening, and far preferable to facing the judgment of Eagar's townsfolk every day. Blake himself was often gone from sunrise to sunset, working alongside his men rather than merely directing them. When he was present at meals, he was polite but reserved, though Virginia occasionally caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. 2 weeks after her arrival, Virginia was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the pounding of approaching hooves. Looking up, she saw Blake riding hard toward the ranch, his expression grim. He dismounted in a fluid motion, tossing the reins to one of the hands. "Miss Virginia," he called, striding toward her. "Is Mrs. Garrett inside?" "Yes, she's preparing lunch. Is something wrong?" "Got word there's a storm coming. Bad one. Need to get the herd moved to the north pasture where there's better shelter." His eyes scanned the clear blue sky. "Doesn't look like it now, but Dave Miller rode out from town to warn us. He's never wrong about the weather." Virginia followed Blake inside, where he quickly explained the situation to Mrs. Garrett. "We'll need extra food prepared. The men will be working through the night likely. And secure everything that might blow away." He turned to Virginia. "If you're afraid of storms, you're welcome to stay in the main house tonight. Your cabin might get a bit noisy if the wind picks up." "I'll be fine," Virginia assured him, touched by his concern. "I'll help Mrs. Garrett prepare provisions for the men." Blake nodded, already turning to leave. "Be careful, both of you. Stay inside once it hits." By mid-afternoon, the sky had transformed from clear blue to an ominous dark gray. The wind had picked up considerably, and Virginia could feel the drop in pressure that signaled an approaching storm. She and Mrs. Garrett had prepared sandwiches, coffee, and hardtack for the men, who had all ridden out to move the herd to safety. As evening approached, the first raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the ranch in stark white flashes, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Virginia had just finished securing the shutters on the main house windows when she heard a shout from outside. Peering through the rain, she saw Blake and 2 of his hands riding in, soaked to the skin and mud splattered. She rushed to the door, holding it open as they staggered in. "The others?" Mrs. Garrett asked anxiously. "Still with the herd," Blake replied, removing his dripping hat. "They've got the cattle mostly moved, but Pete took a bad fall when his horse spooked at the lightning. We brought him back." Virginia noticed then that the third man was being supported between Blake and the other hand, his face contorted with pain. "Let's get him to the sofa," she said, immediately taking charge. "Mrs. Garrett will need hot water and bandages." As they lowered the injured cowboy onto the sofa, Virginia could see that his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "It's broken," she said, meeting Blake's eyes. "We'll need to set it." Blake looked surprised. "You know how? My father was a doctor in St. Louis. I assisted him sometimes." It was a skill she had never expected to use again, especially after Jeremiah had made it clear that a rancher's wife had no business involving herself in such matters. For the next hour, Virginia directed Blake and the other ranch hand, Tom, as they created a makeshift splint for Pete's leg. The young cowboy gritted his teeth against the pain as they straightened the limb, and Virginia administered laudanum from Mrs. Garrett's medicine cabinet to help him bear it. Once Pete was resting as comfortably as possible under the circumstances, Blake stepped outside onto the covered porch, and Virginia followed, concerned about his own exhaustion. The storm continued to rage, but the porch offered shelter from the worst of it. Blake stood at the railing, looking out at the rain-lashed landscape, his profile illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. "You did well in there," he said without turning. "Pete owes you his thanks. I'm just glad I could help. Will the others be all right with the herd?" "They know what they're doing. Found good shelter in the North Valley." He finally turned to face her, and Virginia was struck by the intensity in his eyes. "You're full of surprises, Miss Sanders." "Virginia," she corrected softly. "After setting a man's broken leg together, I think we can dispense with formalities, Mr. Sutton." A small smile touched his lips. "Blake, then." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the storm. Virginia was acutely aware of his presence beside her, tall, solid, reassuring amid the chaos of the elements. "Why did you really hire me, Blake?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been nagging at her for weeks finally finding voice. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for something beyond your control, to be found wanting for reasons that have nothing to do with your character or your heart." Virginia's breath caught. "What happened to you?" Blake's gaze returned to the storm, as if finding it easier to speak to the darkness than directly to her. "I was married once back in Texas. Her name was Catherine. We were young, had big dreams. But we lost our first baby before it was born, and then another. The doctor said Catherine shouldn't try again, it was too dangerous, but she wanted a child so badly." He paused, and Virginia could see the painful memories etched in the tightness of his jaw. "The third pregnancy killed her. And our son lived just long enough to be named James after my father." His hands gripped the porch railing so tightly his knuckles showed white. "Her family blamed me, said if I'd been man enough to stop her from trying again, she'd still be alive. The whole town took their side. I couldn't stay there with all those accusing eyes, all those whispers." Virginia felt tears welling in her eyes, both for his loss and for the unexpected connection between them, both judged and found wanting in the realm of family and children. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, instinctively placing her hand over his on the railing. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face. "When I heard what Jeremiah did casting you aside because you couldn't give him children, it made me sick. A man who would do that never deserved you in the first place." Virginia was stunned by his vehemence, by the protective anger in his voice. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I know enough," he replied. "I've watched you these past weeks, how hard you work, how kind you are to everyone, even old Jenkins who barely speaks 2 words to anyone. I see how you stop to help the barn cats, saving scraps for them even though most folks would just see them as mouse catchers. A person shows their true character in the small moments when they think no one's watching." Virginia felt her cheeks warm at his observations, touched that he had noticed such details. The storm chose that moment to intensify, a particularly violent gust of wind driving rain across the porch and forcing them to step back toward the house. As they moved, Virginia's foot slipped on the wet boards, and Blake caught her by the waist, steadying her against his chest. For a heartbeat, they remained frozen, faces inches apart, his hands warm and strong at her waist, her palms pressed against the solid wall of his chest. Virginia could feel his heart beating fast beneath her fingers, matching the sudden acceleration of her own. The moment was broken by Mrs. Garrett calling from inside, asking if they were all right. Blake released Virginia gently, stepping back with a muttered apology. "We should get inside," he said, his voice sounding strained. "The storm's getting worse." As they returned to the warmth of the house, Virginia couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted between them. A door opened that could not easily be closed again. The storm raged through the night, but by morning it had passed, leaving behind a washed clean world glistening with raindrops in the early sunlight. The ranch had weathered it well, a few fence posts down, some roof shingles torn away, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. The rest of Blake's men returned shortly after dawn, tired but triumphant. They had managed to keep the herd safe, losing only 2 calves to the storm. Pete's leg was properly splinted, and he was moved to the bunkhouse to recover, with Virginia promising to check on him regularly. In the following days, Virginia found herself watching Blake more closely, noticing things she had overlooked before: the gentleness in his hands when he helped an injured foal, the patience he showed teaching a new ranch hand how to rope, the quiet dignity with which he carried his responsibilities. And sometimes she caught him watching her too, his blue eyes thoughtful and warm. Spring blossomed fully across the ranch, wildflowers carpeting the meadows and new life appearing everywhere: foals, calves, even a nest of baby rabbits that Virginia discovered near her cabin. She found herself settling into life at S. The pain of her divorce gradually receding as new experiences and friendships filled the void Jeremiah had left. One evening in late May, as Virginia was returning from gathering eggs at the henhouse, she spotted Blake sitting alone on a fallen log near the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the ranch yard. Something in his posture, head bowed, shoulders slumped, spoke of a private sorrow. She hesitated, basket of eggs in hand, debating whether to leave him to his thoughts or offer company. Before she could decide, he looked up and saw her. He straightened slightly but didn't rise or call out, leaving the choice to approach entirely up to her. Virginia set her basket safely on the ground and walked toward him, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. "May I join you?" she asked softly. Blake nodded, shifting slightly to make room for her on the log. "Just watching the sunset," he said, though his expression suggested his thoughts had been far darker than the golden light currently painting the horizon. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the gentle gurgle of the creek and distant lowing of cattle. "Today would have been James's 5th birthday," Blake finally said, his voice rough. "My son." Virginia's heart constricted with sympathy. "You still count the days. Some dates are burned into you, can't forget them even if you want to." Virginia nodded, understanding all too well. "I lost a baby too," she confessed, the words coming more easily than she expected. "Early in my marriage to Jeremiah. I was only a few months along, but I've always wondered who that child might have become." Blake turned to look at her, surprise and shared grief in his eyes. "Jeremiah told everyone you were barren, that you couldn't conceive at all. It was easier for his pride, I suppose. The truth is, after I lost the baby, I never conceived again. The doctor said there was scarring, that it would be difficult but not impossible for me to carry a child to term." Her hands twisted in her lap. Jeremiah didn't want to keep trying. He wanted certainty and heir for his ranch, his legacy. When it became clear I couldn't guarantee that, he decided I was defective. "Fool," Blake muttered, anger flashing across his features. "A child isn't the only legacy a person leaves," Virginia smiled sadly. "In Eagar, for a man like Jeremiah, it seemed to be the only one that mattered." "And what about for you?" Blake asked, his gaze intent. "Was a child the only future you wanted?" Virginia considered the question, realizing that no one, not Jeremiah, not the town gossips, not even herself, had ever asked what she truly wanted beyond motherhood. "I wanted a partnership," she said slowly, discovering the truth as she spoke it. "Someone to build a life with, to share joys and sorrows. Children would have been a blessing, but they weren't the only blessing I sought." She glanced at Blake. "What about you? Did you come to Arizona territory just to escape the past, or were you looking for something?" "Peace at first," he admitted. "Then purpose. Found both in this land, these mountains." He gestured toward the vast expanse of his ranch, now gilded by the setting sun. "Built something that matters, something that will last." He paused, then added more quietly, "But lately I've been thinking it's not enough to build something if there's no one to share it with." The weight of his words hung between them, charged with possibilities neither had dared voice before. Virginia's heart beat faster as Blake's gaze met hers, open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen. Virginia, whatever he had been about to say was cut short by a shout from the direction of the house. They both turned to see one of the ranch hands waving urgently. "Boss." "Riders coming in. Looks like trouble." Blake was on his feet instantly, his expression shifting from open vulnerability to alert wariness. "Stay here," he told Virginia, but she was already rising to follow him. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "This is my home too now." Something flashed in his eyes at her words: surprise, pleasure, respect, but he didn't argue, simply nodding as they hurried together toward the main house. As they reached the yard, Virginia saw 3 riders approaching at a canter, dust rising from their horses' hooves. With a jolt of shock, she recognized the man in the lead, Jeremiah Holcomb, his face set in hard lines of anger and determination. Blake must have recognized him too, for she felt him tense beside her. "What business could he have here?" he murmured. "I don't know," Virginia replied, her stomach knotting with anxiety. She hadn't seen or heard from Jeremiah since the divorce, and his sudden appearance filled her with dread. The riders pulled up in front of the house, and Jeremiah dismounted smoothly, handing his reins to one of his companions. He was dressed as Virginia remembered him, expensively, with a silk waistcoat beneath his trail dusty coat and a polished gun belt at his hip. "Sutton," he called, ignoring Virginia completely. "I've come to discuss a business matter with you." Blake stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Virginia in a subtly protective stance. "Holcomb, you're a long way from your own ranch. What business brings you to Double S?" Jeremiah's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Water rights. The creek that runs through your east pasture continues down to my property. I'm here to buy the rights to it." Blake's expression remained neutral, but Virginia could sense his wariness. "That creek waters half my herd. It's not for sale. Everything has a price, Sutton." Jeremiah's gaze finally slid to Virginia, cold and dismissive. "As I'm sure my former wife has discovered." Blake's posture stiffened, but his voice remained controlled. "Miss Sanders is a valued employee of this ranch, and you'll speak of her with respect while you're on my property, Holcomb." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "Employee? Is that what they're calling it these days?" His implication was clear, and Virginia felt her cheeks burn with indignation. "State your business plainly or leave," Blake said, his patience visibly thinning. "Very well. I need that water. My northern pastures are drying up with this year's drought, and without access to more water, I'll lose half my herd by August." Jeremiah reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I'm prepared to offer a fair price for the water rights." Blake didn't take the paper. "The answer is no. That same drought affects my ranch too. I can't sell what my own cattle need to survive." Jeremiah's expression hardened. "I was hoping to resolve this amicably, but I should warn you I've filed a claim with the territorial court. If you won't sell willingly, I'll use other means." "On what grounds?" Blake demanded. "Prior claim. My ranch was established before yours. I can argue that my use of the water takes precedence." "That's not true," Virginia interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. "The Double S was operating before you expanded north, Jeremiah. I saw the purchase documents myself when you bought the Wilkins property last year." Jeremiah's cold eyes fixed on her. "Stay out of matters that don't concern you, Virginia. You have no rights to speak of ranch business anymore." "She has every right," Blake countered, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's correct. My claim to that water predates yours, and any judge with half a brain will recognize that." The tension between the two men was palpable, like storm clouds gathering before a deluge. Virginia feared it might come to violence, especially when she noticed Jeremiah's hand drifting closer to his gun. "Gentlemen," she said firmly, stepping forward, "perhaps there's a compromise to be reached. Surely there's enough water for both ranches if managed properly." Jeremiah scoffed, but Blake gave her a considering look. "What are you suggesting?" "A shared irrigation system, perhaps. Controlled access that ensures both ranches receive what they need without depleting the source." It was a solution she had heard her father discuss once with neighboring farmers back in Missouri during a particularly dry season. Blake nodded slowly. "It could work. We'd need to build some diversion channels, install control gates." "Ridiculous," Jeremiah snapped. "I won't be beholden to another rancher's goodwill for my water supply." "It's not goodwill, it's mutual interest," Virginia argued, "and a far better solution than costly legal battles that might drag on for years." For a moment it seemed Jeremiah might consider the idea, but then his pride reasserted itself. "No, I came to buy full rights, not half measures. Think on my offer, Sutton. I'll be back in a week for your answer." He turned to remount his horse. "Don't waste your time," Blake called after him. "The answer will still be no." Jeremiah paused, one foot in the stirrup. "We'll see about that. Things happen to stubborn ranchers in these parts. Fences get cut, fires start, cattle wander off." The threat hung in the air, undisguised. "Are you threatening me, Holcomb?" Blake's hand moved to rest on his own gun. "Merely stating facts," Jeremiah replied with a cold smile. "Think carefully about your options." With that, he swung into the saddle and wheeled his horse around, his companions following as they rode away in a cloud of dust. Virginia and Blake stood in silence, watching until the riders disappeared over the ridge. "I'm sorry," Virginia said finally. "Jeremiah has always been determined when it comes to getting his way." Blake's expression was grim. "I've dealt with men like him before. He doesn't scare me." He turned to Virginia, his concern evident. "Are you all right? I know it can't have been easy seeing him again." "I'm fine," she assured him, surprised to find it was mostly true. Seeing Jeremiah had stirred old hurts, but she felt none of the devastation she might have expected months ago. "I'm more worried about his threats. Jeremiah doesn't make them lightly." Blake nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We'll increase patrols, keep a closer eye on the herd. I won't let him bully us into giving up water we need." "Us." The word warmed Virginia in ways she hadn't expected. Somehow, in the months since she'd come to Double S, she had found not just employment but belonging, a place where her opinion mattered, where she was valued. "What about your idea?" Blake asked as they walked back toward the house. "The shared irrigation system. Do you think it could really work?" Virginia nodded, pleased that he was taking her suggestion seriously. "My father helped implement something similar in Missouri. It would require cooperation and trust, of course, which might be asking too much of Jeremiah." "I'm willing to try if he is," Blake said. "Water's too precious out here to waste fighting over it when there could be enough for both, with proper management." As they reached the porch, Blake paused, turning to face Virginia. The sunset cast a golden glow over his features, softening the hard edges of concern that Jeremiah's visit had etched there. "You never cease to amaze me," he said quietly, "coming up with practical solutions while Holcomb and I were posturing like territorial bulls." Virginia smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Someone had to be the sensible one. His answering smile transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes in a way that made Virginia's heart skip a beat. For a moment, she thought he might say more, might return to the conversation that had been interrupted by Jeremiah's arrival. But the moment passed, and Blake simply held the door open for her as they went inside to inform Mrs. Garrett and the others of the potential trouble brewing. That night, Virginia lay awake in her cabin, replaying the events of the day. The tender moment by the creek, Jeremiah's unwelcome appearance, the tension that now hung over the ranch, all of it swirled in her mind. But what kept returning like a melody she couldn't forget were Blake's words. "Lately I've been thinking it's not enough to build something if there's no one to share it with." Had he been about to say something more, to offer her? What? Friendship, partnership, something deeper? The uncertainty kept her tossing and turning long into the night. The next morning brought practical concerns that pushed romantic musings aside. Blake gathered all the ranch hands after breakfast, outlining increased security measures in light of Jeremiah's threats. "Double the night patrols, especially along the creek and the north boundary," he instructed. "Check the fences twice daily. Any sign of tampering, you report it immediately." The men nodded, their faces serious. They were loyal to Blake and took threats to the ranch as personal affronts. "What about Miss Virginia?" asked Tom, the youngest of the hands. "If Holcomb's got a grudge, she might be in danger too." Blake's expression darkened. "She doesn't go anywhere alone until this is resolved. Mrs. Garrett, you'll keep her close to the house." The housekeeper nodded firmly. "Like my own shadow." Virginia wanted to protest being treated as someone who needed protection, but she knew they were right to be cautious. Jeremiah's pride had been wounded by their divorce, and seeing her established at another ranch might have rekindled his resentment. As the men dispersed to their duties, Blake approached Virginia. "I'm riding into town to speak with the sheriff about Holcomb's threats. Is there anything you need while I'm there? Some thread from the mercantile, if it's not too much trouble. And perhaps you could post a letter to my cousin in St. Louis." She had written to Ellen the previous week, sharing news of her new position and life at SS. "Of course," Blake agreed, his expression softening. "I should be back by sundown. Stay close to the house." After he left, Virginia threw herself into her daily tasks with extra vigor, trying to distract herself from worries about Jeremiah's threats. She helped Mrs. Garrett preserve the season's first strawberries, mended shirts for the ranch hands, and took lunch out to Pete, whose broken leg was healing well but still kept him confined to the bunkhouse. By mid-afternoon, she had run out of indoor tasks and was restless with inactivity. The garden needed weeding, and surely that was close enough to the house to be safe. Mrs. Garrett was napping, exhausted from the morning's canning, and Virginia decided not to wake her. She would just spend a quick half-hour in the garden, well within sight of the main house. The sun was warm on her back as she knelt among the rows of vegetables, pulling weeds and checking the progress of young plants. It was peaceful work, allowing her mind to wander. She found herself thinking again about Blake's almost confession by the creek, wondering what might have developed between them if Jeremiah hadn't interrupted. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the approaching rider until a shadow fell across her. Looking up with a start, Virginia found herself staring at one of Jeremiah's ranch hands, a rough-looking man named Caleb, whom she remembered disliking for his cruel treatment of horses. "Mrs. Holcomb," he said with a mocking tip of his hat. "Or I guess it's back to Miss Sanders now, ain't it?" Virginia rose quickly, brushing dirt from her hands. "What do you want, Caleb? Mr. Sutton isn't here. I know. Saw him ride into town." The man's smile sent a chill down Virginia's spine. "Mr. Holcomb sent me with a message for Sutton. Thought maybe you could deliver it for me." Virginia glanced toward the main house, wondering if she could make it inside before he could dismount. "I'll tell him you came by." "Oh, the message is a bit more substantial than that." Caleb reached behind him and pulled out a folded document from his saddlebag. "Legal papers. Mr. Holcomb's filing his water claim tomorrow, unless Sutton agrees to sell. Relieved that the man seemed to truly be on ranch business, Virginia stepped forward to take the papers. "I'll make sure he receives them." As she reached for the document, Caleb suddenly grabbed her wrist, his grip painful. "Mr. Holcomb also said to tell you personally that he ain't pleased seeing you playing house with Sutton. Says it reflects poorly on his reputation, his ex-wife shacking up with another rancher so quick." Virginia tried to pull away, anger replacing her initial fear. "Release me at once. How dare you, how dare I what? Touch damaged goods," Caleb sneered, tightening his grip. "Everyone knows why Holcomb cast you aside. Can't even do the one thing a woman's made for." White-hot fury surged through Virginia. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby garden trowel with her free hand and brought it down hard on Caleb's arm. He yelped in pain and released her, cursing violently. "You little problem here." The new voice came from behind Virginia. She turned to see Mrs. Garrett standing on the porch, a shotgun held confidently in her hands and aimed directly at Caleb. "Just delivering a message for Mr. Sutton," Caleb muttered, nursing his arm. "Then deliver it and be on your way," Mrs. Garrett said coldly. "And in the future, messages can be left at the front door." Caleb threw the document on the ground at Virginia's feet. "Holcomb won't forget this," he spat, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away. Once he was gone, Virginia's knees went weak with delayed fear and she sank back to the ground. Mrs. Garrett hurried to her side, shotgun still in hand. "Are you hurt, child? Did he touch you?" "Just grabbed my wrist," Virginia assured her, holding up her arm to show the red marks that would likely bruise. "Nothing worse than that. Thank you for coming when you did." Mrs. Garrett helped her to her feet. "I heard voices and knew Blake wouldn't want any visitors while he was gone." She looked Virginia over with concern. "Let's get you inside and put some witch hazel on that wrist." As they walked toward the house, Virginia bent to retrieve the dropped document. "He said these are legal papers for Blake, about Jeremiah's water claim." Mrs. Garrett snorted. "More likely it's just another threat. That man never did know how to take no for an answer." Inside, as Mrs. Garrett tended to her wrist, Virginia unfolded the document with her free hand. It did indeed appear to be a legal filing, full of formal language about water rights and prior claims. But tucked inside was a separate note, written in Jeremiah's distinctive hand. "Sutton, reconsider my offer. I know about your past in Texas. A man who couldn't protect his own wife and child has no business playing protector to mine. Sell the water rights or everyone in the territory will know your shameful history." "JH," Virginia gasped, the paper trembling in her hand. "He's threatening to expose Blake's past," she told Mrs. Garrett. "About his wife and son in Texas. How could he possibly know about that, Mrs.?" Garrett's expression darkened. Small territories, long memories. Someone probably recognized Blake from Texas and shared the gossip with Holcomb. That man collects other people's secrets like some collect stamps. "This will devastate Blake," Virginia said, distressed. "He came here to escape those painful memories, to start fresh where no one knew his history." "Blake's stronger than you think," Mrs. Garrett replied, though concern lined her face. "But you're right, he won't take this threat lightly." When Blake returned from town that evening, Virginia and Mrs. Garrett were waiting for him in the parlor. One look at their faces told him something had happened in his absence. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, setting down his packages. "Are you hurt?" His eyes found the faint bruises forming on Virginia's wrist, and his expression hardened. Virginia quickly explained Caleb's visit, showing Blake both the legal document and Jeremiah's threatening note. As he read it, she watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a tightly controlled anger that was somehow more frightening than an outburst would have been. "I'll kill him," Blake said quietly, the paper crumpling in his fist. Blake, no. Virginia moved to his side, placing a gentle hand on his arm. That's exactly what he wants to provoke you into doing something rash. She's right, Mrs. Garrett agreed. Holcomb's trying to back you into a corner. If you react with violence, he wins. Blake took a deep breath, visibly struggling for control. He threatened you, had his man put hands on you. His gaze dropped to Virginia's bruised wrist, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. I can't let that stand. And you won't, Virginia assured him. But we need to be smarter than Jeremiah. Fighting him directly plays into his hands. Blake looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. We need a different approach. He straightened, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. First things first, you're moving into the main house. No more staying alone in the cabin until this is resolved. Virginia started to protest, but Mrs. Garrett cut her off. He's right, dear. It's not safe, and what would people say? You'll take the blue room upstairs, right across from mine. Perfectly respectable. Seeing that both were determined, Virginia acquiesced. All right, but what about Jeremiah's threats? About exposing your past? Blake's expression darkened again. Let him. I've done nothing to be ashamed of. Losing Catherine and James was a tragedy, not a disgrace. He looked at Virginia intently. I won't be blackmailed into giving up water at this ranch that all of us depend on. His resolve strengthened Virginia's own courage. Then we stand together and face whatever comes. Together, Blake agreed. And in that simple word, Virginia heard a promise that went beyond their current troubles, a foundation for something that might, with time and trust, grow into something deeper. The following days brought increased tensions as Jeremiah made good on his legal threat, filing his water claim with the territorial court. Blake responded with his own filing, presenting documentation of the double estiquette's prior use of the creek. The matter was set for a hearing in 2 weeks' time, but Virginia doubted Jeremiah would wait quietly for legal proceedings to take their course. She was proven right 3 nights later when one of the ranch hands came galloping in from the night patrol, shouting that a section of fence along the northern boundary had been cut and a dozen head of cattle were missing. Blake and his men rode out immediately, leaving the ranch house under the watchful eye of Pete, who might have a broken leg but could still handle a rifle. Virginia and Mrs. Garrett spent an anxious night waiting for news, jumping at every sound. Dawn was breaking when Blake and the others returned, tired and mud-splattered. They had found the cattle in a box canyon several miles away, but had seen no sign of the rustlers. It was Holcomb's work, Blake told Virginia as she helped tend a cut on his forearm, sustained while rounding up the scattered cattle. Too organized to be ordinary rustlers, they knew exactly which fence to cut, which cattle to take. Can you prove it? Virginia asked, gently cleaning the wound. Blake shook his head. Not enough to satisfy the law. Sheriff Jenkins says without witnesses or evidence linking directly to Holcomb, there's nothing he can do. Virginia frowned, concentrating on bandaging his arm to hide her worry. What will you do now? Double the patrols again? Arm everyone, even the cook. Blake managed a weary smile, and figure out a way to end this before someone gets seriously hurt. Despite their vigilance, the incidents continued. A small fire set in the south pasture, though quickly contained. Shots fired at a night patrol, though thankfully missing their targets, and rumors spread in town questioning Blake's character and past. Through it all, Virginia remained by Blake's side, her presence a steady source of strength and practical counsel. Living in the main house brought them into closer daily contact, and Virginia found herself growing increasingly aware of him, the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to his clothes, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled. the gentleness in his hands when he helped her down from a wagon or passed her a dish at dinner. One evening, a week before the court hearing, Blake found Virginia in the study, poring over maps of the ranch and surrounding properties. "It's late," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You should get some rest." Virginia looked up, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "I'm trying to understand the water situation better. If we could just make Jeremiah see reason about sharing the resource." Blake moved to stand beside her, looking down at the maps. "You still think your irrigation plan could work?" "I do." "Look here." She pointed to where the creek entered his property. "If we built a diversion system here, with measured gates to control flow, both ranches could have guaranteed water even in drought years. It would cost less than ongoing legal battles, and in the end, everyone benefits." Blake studied the maps thoughtfully. "The problem isn't the plan, it's Holcomb. He doesn't want a solution, he wants to win." "People can change," Virginia said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of this when it came to her ex-husband. "Some can," Blake agreed, his gaze shifting from the maps to her face. "You've changed since you came here. You're stronger, more confident." Virginia smiled, touched by his observation. "I've had good reason to find my strength again." Blake moved a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "Virginia, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, something I started to say that day by the creek before Holcomb interrupted." Virginia's heart began to race. "Yes." He took a deep breath. "When you first came to Double S, I offered you a job because I wanted to help someone who was suffering unfairly the way I once did. But these past months, watching you rebuild your life, seeing your courage and kindness, I've come to care for you in ways I never expected." Virginia stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment. "I know it might be too soon," Blake continued, his voice low and earnest. "You're still healing from what Holcomb did to you, and I don't want to pressure you. But I need you to know that whatever happens with this water dispute, with the ranch, my feelings for you won't change." Emotion welled up in Virginia's throat, making speech difficult. "Blake." A sudden pounding on the front door interrupted her response, followed by Mrs. Garrett's voice calling urgently. "Blake, Virginia, come quick." They rushed to the entrance hall to find Mrs. Garrett admitting a soot-covered, panicked young man, one of the Wilkins boys from a neighboring small farm. "Mr. Sutton, sir," the boy gasped. "Fire at our place. Pa sent me to ask for help. It's spreading fast toward the woods, and if it reaches there, it could threaten both our properties." Blake was already moving, calling for his men. "How did it start?" he asked the boy as they headed for the door. "Don't rightly know, sir. Pa found the barn burning when he went to do evening chores. Says it looks deliberate fire started from outside, not within." Blake and Virginia exchanged a look of grim understanding. This had Jeremiah's fingerprints all over it, another pressure tactic, this time affecting innocent neighbors. "Virginia, stay here with Mrs. Garrett," Blake instructed. "Keep the house secure." "No," Virginia countered firmly. "I'm coming too. The Wilkins have children, they'll need help while the men fight the fire." Blake hesitated, clearly wanting to keep her safe, but he knew she was right. "Stay close to Tom or Jenkins," he finally agreed. Within minutes, they were riding hard for the Wilkins farm, the night sky ahead already glowing ominously orange. As they crested the last hill, Virginia gasped at the sight below. The barn was fully engulfed, and the fire had already spread to a nearby field of dry grass, creeping steadily toward the woods that separated the Wilkins property from the eastern edge of Double S. The next hours passed in a blur of smoke, heat, and desperate activity. While Blake and his men joined Mr. Wilkins and other neighbors who had arrived to battle the main blaze, Virginia helped Mrs. Wilkins evacuate her 4 young children to a safe distance, then returned to assist in forming a bucket brigade from the well to the advancing fire line. The work was exhausting, the smoke stinging her eyes and choking her lungs, but Virginia refused to falter. This was her home now, these people her neighbors and friends, and she would fight alongside them with every ounce of strength she possessed. It was well past midnight when they finally gained control of the fire, having dug fire breaks and beaten back the flames before they could reach the tinder dry woods. The barn was a total loss, and one field was burned black, but the Wilkins house and livestock had been saved. As dawn broke, casting pale light over the smoky, exhausted group, Virginia found herself standing next to Blake at the edge of the burned field. His face was streaked with soot, his clothes singed in places, but his expression as he looked at the damage was one of quiet fury rather than defeat. "It was Jeremiah," Virginia said softly, not a question but a statement of certainty. Blake nodded. Wilkins found a kerosene-soaked rag and the remains of a timer device in what's left of the barn. Sophisticated arson, not an accident. But why target the Wilkins family? "They have nothing to do with your water dispute." "They do, though," Blake replied grimly. "Their farm sits between my ranch and Holcomb's northern pasture. If I won't sell him water rights, he needs another way to access the creek, like buying out the Wilkins family when they can no longer afford to keep their farm after losing their barn and crops." The calculated cruelty of it stole Virginia's breath. "That's monstrous." "That's Jeremiah Holcomb," Blake said, his jaw tight with anger. "And it ends now. I won't let anyone else get hurt because of his greed." Virginia placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "What are you going to do?" Before Blake could answer, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Turning, Virginia felt a chill run through her. Despite the lingering heat of the fire, Jeremiah himself was riding toward them, accompanied by 2 of his men, including Caleb. Blake stepped slightly in front of Virginia, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Jeremiah reined in a few yards away, surveying the damage with an expression of false concern. "Terrible thing, fire," he said, his voice dripping with insincere sympathy. "Wilkins is fortunate to have such good neighbors willing to help." "Cut the act, Holcomb," Blake replied coldly. "We know you set this fire." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation, Sutton. Have any proof?" "Enough for the sheriff," Blake countered. "Wilkins found evidence of arson, and we all know who benefits if his family has to sell their land." Jeremiah's mask of concern fell away, replaced by hard calculation. "Accidents happen all the time in ranch country. Sometimes they keep happening until people make smart decisions." His gaze shifted to Virginia, and his lip curled slightly. "Like realizing when they are outmatched and should cut their losses." Virginia felt Blake tense beside her, ready to lunge at Jeremiah, but she tightened her grip on his arm. "He's not worth it," she murmured. Jeremiah laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "Still hiding behind women's skirts, Sutton. First in Texas, now here. Some things never change." Blake's expression darkened dangerously. "Say what you came to say, Holcomb, then get off my neighbor's land before I forget my better judgment." "Very well." Jeremiah leaned forward in his saddle. "One last offer. Sell me the water rights, and I'll withdraw my claim with the court. I'll even throw in compensation for the Wilkins family's barn, call it a gesture of community goodwill. And if I refuse, then I can't be responsible for what might happen next." Jeremiah's threat hung in the air like the smoke still rising from the burned barn. "Fires, rustling those are just the beginning. How many people are you willing to put at risk for your pride, Sutton? How many lives are water rights worth to you?" Virginia had heard enough. Stepping forward, she faced her ex-husband directly for the first time since their divorce. "Stop this, Jeremiah. There's a solution that benefits everyone's shared water rights, a joint irrigation system. Why turn this into a war that hurts innocent people?" Jeremiah looked at her as if she were something unpleasant he'd found on his boot. "Stay out of this, Virginia. This is men's business." "It's everyone's business when you're threatening an entire community," she retorted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Water is life out here, but it doesn't have to be controlled by one person. Cooperation would ensure everyone has enough." "Cooperation," Jeremiah scoffed. "That's for the weak. Strong men take what they need." "Strong men protect what matters without destroying others," Blake countered. "Your offer is refused, Holcomb. Now leave." For a tense moment, Virginia thought Jeremiah might order his men to attack, but after a long stare at Blake, he merely shrugged. "The court hearing is in 6 days. I suggest you reconsider before then for everyone's sake." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. Once they were out of sight, Virginia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "He sees this as a challenge to his authority, his manhood." Blake nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Then we'll need to be prepared for whatever comes next." As they rode back to the ranch, Virginia was acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted between them, not just in their feelings for each other, which had been building for months, but in their shared resolve to stand against Jeremiah's threats together. The conversation interrupted in the study remained unfinished, but its essence hung between them, a promise waiting to be fulfilled once the current crisis had passed. The days leading up to the court hearing were tense but, surprisingly, free of further incidents. Virginia suspected Jeremiah was biding his time, perhaps hoping that fear of what might come would be enough to change Blake's mind. Blake used the respite to strengthen the ranch's defenses, while also helping the Wilkins family begin rebuilding their barn. The neighboring small farmers and ranchers, having witnessed Jeremiah's tactics firsthand, rallied around Double S with offers of assistance and additional patrols. What Jeremiah had intended as a dividing tactic had instead united the community. The evening before the hearing, Virginia found Blake on the front porch, staring out at the gathering dusk. The last rays of sunset caught in his dark hair, highlighting strands of silver at his temples that hadn't been there when she first arrived at Double S. "You should get some rest," she said softly, joining him at the railing. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "I'm not sure I could sleep anyway," he admitted. "Too much on my mind." Virginia understood. The court hearing would determine not just water rights but, in many ways, the future of both ranches. "Whatever the judge decides, we'll face it together." Blake turned to look at her, his expression softening. "You know, when you first came here, I never imagined how important you would become not just to the ranch, but to me." Virginia's heart quickened. "Blake, let me finish," he said gently. "I need to say this before tomorrow in case." He took a deep breath. "In case things don't go our way." Virginia nodded, letting him continue. "After I lost Catherine and James, I thought that part of my life was over. I came here to build something new, something that wouldn't depend on the kind of vulnerability that nearly destroyed me in Texas." His gaze held her steadily. "But then you arrived, and despite everything you'd been through, you had this light in you, this strength and kindness that I couldn't ignore." He took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "I've fallen in love with you, Virginia. Not despite your past, or what Jeremiah called your barrenness, but because of who you are, your courage, your intelligence, your heart. And I want you to know that, whatever happens tomorrow or in the days to come." Virginia felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for months, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. After Jeremiah, I didn't trust my own judgment, my own heart." "And now?" Blake asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Now I know what real love looks like," she replied, raising a hand to touch his cheek. "It looks like respect and partnership. It looks like you, Blake Sutton." For a moment they stood perfectly still, the confession hanging between them like a fragile, precious thing. Then Blake lowered his head and kissed her, gentle at first, then with growing passion as Virginia responded in kind. It was a kiss of promise and hope, of shared strength and future possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he murmured, "when Holcomb is no longer a threat to us, I want to build a life with you, Virginia, if you'll have me." "There's nothing I want more," she assured him, her heart so full it felt near to bursting. The tender moment was interrupted by Mrs. Garrett clearing her throat from the doorway. "Supper's ready," she announced, her expression a mixture of approval and practical concern. "You'll need your strength for tomorrow." As they followed her inside, Blake kept Virginia's hand in his, a small gesture that felt like a declaration to themselves, to Mrs. Garrett, and soon to the entire world. The territorial courthouse in the county seat was crowded the next morning. Word of the water dispute had spread, and many local ranchers and farmers had come to witness the proceedings, recognizing that the outcome might set precedent for future water conflicts in the drought-prone region. Virginia sat directly behind Blake, wearing her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. Mrs. Garrett sat beside her, offering silent support, while Blake's ranch hands filled the bench behind them. On the opposite side of the small courtroom, Jeremiah sat with his lawyer, a slick-looking man from Phoenix who was known for representing wealthy clients. When Judge Harrison entered, the room fell silent. He was an older man with a reputation for fairness and little patience for legal maneuvering. After the initial formalities, he called for Jeremiah's lawyer to present their case. The attorney rose smoothly, presenting maps and documents purporting to show that Jeremiah's ranch had historical rights to the creek water due to his purchase of the old Whitman property, which predated Blake's ranch. He argued eloquently about prior appropriation doctrine and senior water rights, concluding with a pointed reference to how newcomers to the territory shouldn't be allowed to disrupt established water usage patterns. When it was Blake's turn, he rose without a lawyer he had chosen to represent himself, feeling that the truth was straightforward enough to stand on its own. Virginia watched with pride as he calmly presented his own documentation, showing that, while the Whitman property was indeed older than S, it had never used water from the disputed creek until after Jeremiah purchased it and expanded north, well after Blake had established his water usage. "Your Honor," Blake concluded, "water is the lifeblood of every ranch and farm in this territory. I don't deny Mr. Holcomb's need for it, I simply maintain that there's enough for both of us if managed properly. I've proposed a shared irrigation system that would ensure fair distribution, but Mr. Holcomb has rejected all compromise in favor of trying to seize complete control." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "This shared system, you have details of how it would work?" Blake nodded, producing the plans that he and Virginia had refined over the past weeks. "Yes, Your Honor. The design ensures equitable distribution based on acreage and historical usage, with adjustments for drought years." As the judge examined the plans, Jeremiah's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, my client rejects any such arrangement. Water rights are not meant to be divided, they belong entirely to the senior appropriator, which in this case is clearly the Holcomb Ranch. Judge Harrison frowned at the interruption. I'll determine what's clear in this case, counselor. He studied the plans for a few more moments, then looked up at Blake. This is quite detailed, Mr. Sutton. Did you design this yourself? No, Your Honor. The concept was developed by Miss Virginia Sanders, who works on my ranch and has experience with similar systems from Missouri. Virginia felt all eyes in the courtroom turn to her. Judge Harrison gestured for her to stand. Miss Sanders, is that correct? You designed this system? Virginia rose, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. I adapted it from successful implementations my father oversaw during drought years in Missouri. The principle is simple: water is measured and distributed according to need and historical usage, with agreements in place for how to handle shortages. And you believe this would provide sufficient water for both ranches? I do, Your Honor. Based on the creek's flow rates and both ranches' documented needs, a shared system would be more than adequate in all but the most severe drought conditions, in which case the agreement includes provisions for proportional reductions. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. He turned to Jeremiah. Mr. Holcomb, why have you rejected this compromise? Jeremiah stood, his expression cold. The water originates on land adjacent to mine, Your Honor. By right, it should flow unimpeded to my property first. Sutton's ranch is downstream. Why should I share what's naturally mine? Because water belongs to no single person in a community that depends on it for survival, the judge replied dryly. That's been the principle of water law in arid regions since ancient times. Virginia could see Jeremiah's jaw tighten at the rebuke. Before he could respond, Judge Harrison continued, I've heard enough. Based on the documentation presented and the clear testimony of both parties, I'm ready to rule. He straightened in his chair, his gaze moving between Blake and Jeremiah. In the matter of water rights to Sawmill Creek, I find that both ranches have established legitimate claims to its use. However, Mr. Sutton's documentation clearly shows that his usage predates Mr. Holcomb's expansion into the northern pastures that require this water. Jeremiah began to protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. That said, I'm not inclined to award exclusive rights to either party when a reasonable compromise exists. Therefore, I am ordering the implementation of the shared irrigation system as designed by Miss Sanders, with costs to be split equally between the two ranches. Construction will begin within 30 days, under the supervision of a court-appointed engineer. Virginia felt a surge of relief and satisfaction, but it was short-lived as Jeremiah rose angrily. This is outrageous. You're allowing a woman, my discarded wife, no less, to dictate terms of water usage to established ranchers. I'll appeal to the territorial Supreme Court. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. You're welcome to appeal, Mr. Holcomb, but my ruling stands in the meantime, and I'd advise you to watch your language in my courtroom when referring to Miss Sanders or anyone else. Jeremiah's face flushed with anger, but his lawyer quickly pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently in his ear. The judge brought down his gavel. Court is adjourned. I expect both parties to comply with this ruling immediately and to refrain from any further incidents. While the irrigation system is being constructed, any violation will be considered contempt of court and dealt with accordingly. As the courtroom began to empty, Virginia made her way to Blake's side, her heart full of pride and relief. You did it, she said softly. Blake shook his head, taking her hands in his. We did it. Your design, your testimony, they made all the difference. Their moment of celebration was interrupted by Jeremiah pushing his way toward them, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Sutton. Not by a long shot." Blake stepped protectively in front of Virginia. "It is over, Holcomb. The judge has ruled. Accept it and move on. Move on." Jeremiah's laugh was ugly. "Like Virginia moved on from being my wife to being your whore." The words hung in the air for a shocked second before Blake's fist connected with Jeremiah's jaw, sending him sprawling across a nearby table. Virginia grabbed Blake's arm before he could follow up with another blow. "Stop. He's not worth it, and you'll be held in contempt." Jeremiah was already being helped to his feet by his lawyer, blood trickling from a split lip. "You'll regret that, Sutton," he snarled. "Both of you will." "That's enough." Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension as he re-entered the courtroom, drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Holcomb, I heard your remark and I'm holding you in contempt. Bailiff, escort Mr. Holcomb to a cell until he can cool his temper and pay a fine of $50. As Jeremiah was led away, still hurling threats and insults, the judge turned to Blake. "And you, Mr. Sutton, while I understand the provocation, violence in my courtroom cannot be tolerated. $25 fine, payable before you leave today." Blake nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor, I apologize for my loss of control." Once the judge had left again, Virginia turned to Blake, her expression a mixture of exasperation and affection. "Was that really necessary?" Blake touched his bruised knuckles gingerly. "No," he admitted, "but it sure felt good." Despite herself, Virginia laughed, the tension of the day finally breaking. "Come on, let's pay your fine and go home." Home. The word had such a different meaning now than it had just months ago when she'd arrived at Double S broken and uncertain. Now it meant not just a place, but a feeling of belonging, of purpose, of love. The ride back to the ranch was filled with plans and possibilities. With the water dispute legally resolved, they could focus on implementing the irrigation system and, more importantly, on their future together. "I've been thinking," Blake said as they approached the ranch, the afternoon sun gilding the landscape in warm, golden light. "The east pasture, near the creek, there's a rise there with a view of the whole valley. It would be a perfect spot for a new house." Virginia looked at him questioningly. "A new house? What's wrong with the current one?" "Nothing," Blake replied, a hint of shyness in his smile that made her heart skip. "But that's my house. I was thinking we might want our house." The implication was clear, and Virginia felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Blake Sutton, is that a proposal?" He reined his horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face her fully. "Not exactly. When I propose properly, there'll be a ring and me down on one knee and all the words I've been saving up. But yes, I'm asking if building a future together, a home, a family in whatever form that takes, is something you might want." Virginia's eyes filled with happy tears. "It's everything I want." Blake reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "I can't promise you children, Virginia. The doctor back in Texas said your condition makes it unlikely. But I can promise you my heart, my loyalty, and my partnership for as long as we both live." Virginia squeezed his hand, overwhelmed by the depth of her love for this man who saw her value beyond the narrow definition that Jeremiah and society had tried to impose. "Children or no children, a life with you is more than I ever dared hope for." They continued toward the ranch, their hearts full of plans and dreams. As they approached, they could see Mrs. Garrett on the porch, clearly anxious for news. "Well," she called as they dismounted. "What did the judge say?" Blake grinned, helping Virginia down from her horse. "He ordered Holcomb to implement Virginia's irrigation plan. We won." Mrs. Garrett clapped her hands in delight. "I knew it. That plan of yours was too sensible to ignore, Virginia." She studied their faces, her keen eyes missing nothing. "And judging by those smiles, I'd say more than water rights were decided today." Virginia and Blake exchanged a look, a private communication of love and joy. "You could say that," Blake acknowledged. "There might be wedding bells at Double S before the year is out if Virginia will have me." "If." Mrs. Garrett scoffed. "The way you two have been looking at each other these past months, there's no if about it." She enveloped Virginia in a warm hug. "I couldn't be happier, my dear. You two were meant for each other." That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Virginia felt a peace she hadn't known since before her marriage to Jeremiah, perhaps, had never truly known at all. "You think he'll cause more trouble?" she asked softly, knowing Blake would understand she meant Jeremiah. Blake's arm tightened around her shoulders. "He might try, but the judge's warning was clear. And with the whole community watching, he'd be a fool to push further." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Besides, we're stronger together than any threat he could make." Virginia nodded, settling more comfortably against his side. "Yes, we are." As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Arizona sky, Virginia reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been cast aside, deemed worthless because her body could not perform the one function society had decided was a woman's primary purpose. She had believed those judgments, had carried the weight of them like stones in her heart. Now, in Blake's arms, she understood a deeper truth that love, real love, was not conditional on what a person could provide or produce. It was about who they were at their core, the sum of their strength and weakness, joy and sorrow, gifts and limitations. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Virginia smiled up at him. "About how endings can sometimes be beginnings in disguise." He nodded, understanding immediately. "When Catherine died, I thought my capacity for love died with her. I was wrong. And when Jeremiah divorced me, I thought my value as a woman, as a potential wife, was gone forever," Virginia replied. "I was wrong too." Blake turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Virginia Sanders, you are the strongest, most valuable woman I've ever known. Your worth has nothing to do with whether you can bear children and everything to do with who you are, your mind, your heart, your spirit." Tears filled Virginia's eyes at his words, not tears of sorrow, but of profound gratitude for this man who saw her so clearly and loved her so completely. "I was cast aside for barren arms," she whispered. "But you've still got mine forever," Blake finished, drawing her close. "For as long as we both shall live." And as his lips met hers in a kiss that sealed their promise, Virginia knew that what had once seemed like the end of her world had, in fact, been merely the beginning of a far more beautiful story, one of redemption, of second chances, and of a love strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds. 1 year later, Virginia stood on the porch of the new house that she and Blake had built together on the rise overlooking the east pasture. The shared irrigation system was functioning perfectly, providing water to both Double S and, surprisingly, to Jeremiah's ranch as well. After his initial threats to appeal had come to nothing, Jeremiah had eventually, grudgingly, accepted the judge's ruling and even contributed his share of the construction costs. Virginia hadn't seen him since the court hearing, and she was grateful for that. According to town gossip, he had remarried a young woman from a wealthy Phoenix family and seemed determined to continue his quest for an heir. Virginia found she could now think of him with pity rather than pain, recognizing how empty a life must be when built solely on possession and legacy rather than love and partnership. Her reflections were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Looking up, she saw Blake returning from town, and beside him rode a small, dark-haired figure that made Virginia's heart leap with joy. She hurried down the steps as they dismounted, opening her arms to receive the 8-year-old girl who ran to her with a cry of "Mama Virginia." "Hello, my darling," Virginia said, hugging the child close. "How was your first trip to town?" Lily's dark eyes sparkled with excitement. "It was wonderful. Pa bought me a book of fairy tales, and Mrs. Peterson at the dress shop gave me candy, and everyone was so nice." Blake approached, smiling at the sight of his wife and adopted daughter. "She charmed the entire town," he reported, dropping a kiss on Virginia's cheek. "Just like her mother." Virginia felt her heart swell with love for them both. Lily had come into their lives 6 months earlier, an orphan whose parents, migrant workers at a nearby farm, had died in a flash flood. With no relatives to claim her, the child had faced an uncertain future until Virginia and Blake had stepped forward to offer her a home. The adoption had been finalized just last month, making official what their hearts had known from the start, that Lily belonged with them, completing their family in a way none of them had expected. "I have news," Blake said as they walked toward the house together, Lily skipping ahead. "Ran into Jenkins in town. He says the stagecoach brought mail for you from St. Louis." Virginia's eyes widened. "From Ellen. I've been waiting to hear if she and Robert can visit this summer." Inside, Blake handed her a thick envelope addressed in her cousin's familiar handwriting. Virginia opened it eagerly, reading quickly before looking up with a bright smile. "They're coming, in July for 2 weeks." She continued scanning the letter, then gasped softly. "Oh, Ellen's expecting their second child in December. She says they want us to be the godparents." Blake squeezed her hand, understanding both her joy for her cousin and the bittersweet twinge that accompanied news of others' pregnancies. "That's wonderful news. We'll make sure their visit is special." Virginia nodded, leaning against him gratefully. Though she had made peace with her own inability to bear children, there were still moments when the old sorrow resurfaced. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as their life together, and now, with Lily, filled her heart with a different kind of fulfillment. "I have news too," she said, tucking the letter away. "Mrs. Wilkins stopped by while you were in town. She says there are 2 more children at the mission school in Tucson who need home siblings, a boy and girl. Their parents were killed in an Apache raid near the border." Blake studied her face, reading the unspoken question in her eyes. "You want to meet them?" Virginia nodded. "I thought we could ride to Tucson next week, just to see." He smiled, pulling her close. "You know, when we built this house, I made sure it had plenty of bedrooms for a reason." "You knew, even then?" "I knew that your heart has enough love for many children, whether they grow beneath it or not." He brushed a strand of hair from her face tenderly. "And I knew I wanted to build a family with you, however that might happen." From the kitchen, they heard Lily chattering happily with Mrs. Garrett, who had become a beloved grandmother figure to the child. The sound of their laughter filled the house with warmth that Virginia had once thought she'd never experience again. "We've been blessed," she murmured, resting her head against Blake's chest. "Beyond measure," he agreed. "Though I still thank God every day that Jeremiah Holcomb was fool enough to let you go." Virginia laughed softly. "His loss, your gain." "My greatest gain," Blake corrected, lifting her chin to meet her eyes. "The day you came to Double S was the day my life truly began again." As he lowered his lips to hers in a tender kiss, Virginia thought about the winding path that had led her here, from heartbreak to healing, from rejection to the deepest acceptance she had ever known. The arms that Jeremiah had called Barren now held a child, a husband, a future rich with possibility. It wasn't the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was better, deeper, more meaningful than anything she could have planned. Where once she had been defined by what she lacked, now she was known by what she gave: love, strength, wisdom, care. Not just to Blake and Lily, but to everyone whose life touched hers at Double S. Later that evening, as they sat together on the porch watching Lily chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Blake took Virginia's hand, his expression thoughtful. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "about names for the children in Tucson if they come to live with us." Virginia looked at him in surprise. "You've been giving it that much thought already," he nodded. "The boy is 6, the girl 4. They've lost everything: their parents, their home. They deserve a fresh start, new names if they want them to help build a new life." Virginia's heart swelled with love for this man who thought so deeply about children he hadn't even met yet. "What names were you considering?" Blake's eyes held a hint of moisture in the fading light. "I thought maybe James for the boy, after my son." A way of honoring his memory while looking forward. He paused. "And for the girl, I was thinking Catherine might be nice." Tears filled Virginia's eyes at the gesture: Blake offering to share the most precious, painful parts of his past with these new children who might become part of their future. "I think that's beautiful," she whispered. "A bridge between what was and what could be." Blake squeezed her hand. "Nothing replaces what we've lost, Virginia. Not for me, not for you, not for these children. But together we can build something new from the broken pieces. Something strong and beautiful." As Lily ran back to them, her small hands cupped around a glowing firefly, her face alight with wonder, Virginia felt a certainty settle deep in her soul. This was what she had been meant for all along: not just to be a mother in the conventional sense, but to create family wherever and however it was needed, to offer love without condition, to build bridges between past sorrows and future joys. "Look, Mama, Pa," Lily exclaimed, carefully opening her hands to show them the tiny light. "Isn't it magical?" "Yes, darling," Virginia replied, meeting Blake's gaze over their daughter's head. "The most ordinary things can be magical when shared with the people you love." The firefly flickered once more, then rose from Lily's palms, soaring upward into the deepening twilight, a small light against the vast darkness, but no less bright for its size. Virginia watched it go, her heart full of gratitude for second chances and the unexpected ways that happiness could find you, even after the darkest nights of the soul. Blake's arms slipped around her waist, warm and secure, as the first stars appeared in the sky. "I love you, Virginia Sutton," he murmured. "Every day more than the last." Virginia leaned into his embrace, complete in a way she had never imagined possible when she had arrived at Double S broken and alone. "And I love you, Blake Sutton." With arms that may be barren but are full beyond measure. Together, they watched as more stars emerged, each one a promise, each one a possibility, in a sky vast enough to hold both what had been lost and what had been found, a perfect reflection of the hearts that beat beneath it, scarred but healing, once empty, but now overflowing with love's endless capacity for renewal.